Hello, and welcome to our Food as a Business seminar series. Today's webinar will be focused on produce safety rule with a marketing perspective. Our learning objectives for today's webinar include develop a better understanding of current produce safety requirements, options, and certifications. Develop a better understanding of produce safety on your fresh fruit and vegetable farm. Understand common ways that produce might become contaminated on the farm. And lastly, understand the value of commitment to implementing food safety practices. Many fruit and vegetable producers are already familiar with good agricultural practices, also known as GAPS. GAPS is a voluntary third-party food safety audit that ensures fruits and vegetables are handled in the safest way possible. GAPS is offered by the United States Department of Agriculture. There are several different types of GAPS. You can have USDA GIPN GAP certification, Harmonized GAP, Harmonized GAP Plus, and Group GAP. You can learn more about the different types of GAP and how to obtain them by visiting the FDA or the USDA. The Food Safety Modernization Act, also known as FSMA, was signed into law on January 4, 2011 by President Obama. It is the most sweeping reform of the United States food safety laws in over 70 years. The overall objective of FSMA is to focus on the prevention of food safety issues. Part of FSMA is the Produce Safety Rule. The goal is to regulate fresh produce marketed in the United States to ensure a safe food supply. Again, focused on the prevention on food safety, and it encompasses the entire food system. FSMA regulations cover the entire food supply chain. It includes and covers producers, processors, shippers, handlers, importers of produce sold in the United States. There are 7 components to FSMA, with actions that must be taken into consideration to prevent contamination. You can learn more about FSMA and the different types of rules incorporated into FSMA by visiting the FDA. The FSMA Produce Safety Rule is the first mandatory federal standard for the production of fruits and vegetables in the United States. The following produce is not covered by the Produce Safety Rule. The following produce commodities that the FDA has identified as rarely consumed raw include asparagus, black beans, great northern beans, kidney beans, lima beans, navy beans, and pinto beans, garden beets, including their roots and tops, and sugar beets, cashews, sour cherries, chickpeas, cocoa beans, coffee beans, collards, sweet corn, cranberries, dates, dill, including seeds and weed, eggplants, figs, ginger, hazelnuts, horseradish, lentils, okra, peanuts, pecans, peppermint, potatoes, pumpkins, winter squash, sweet potatoes, and water chestnuts. Also, produce that is used for personal or on-farm consumption is exempt. Produce that is not a raw agricultural commodity. A raw agricultural commodity is any food in its raw or natural state, is exempt from this law. Lastly, the definition of produce does not include food grains, including barley, dent or flint corn, sorghum, oats, rye, rice, wheat, amaranth, quinoa, buckwheat, and oilseeds. Oilseeds include cottonseed, flaxseed, rapeseed, soybean, and sunflower seed. These are exempt from FSMA. The rule includes an exemption for produce that receives commercial processing that adequately reduces the presence of microorganisms of public health significance, under certain conditions and with certain documentation requirements. These documentation requirements include disclosure statements accompanying produce for further processing and annual written assurances from customers. While some growers may be exempt or not covered by the produce safety rule, all growers should be prepared to implement food safety practices because they grow food people eat. Growers may also sell to buyers that require the implementation of food safety practices, including those required in the regulation. Additional exemptions include an average annual produce sales below $25,000. A qualified exemption will include producers whose annual average food sales are less than 500,000 and greater than 50% of the food sold is directly to the end user. End users include farmers markets, restaurants, and retailers in the same state or within a 275-mile radius from the farm. Safety rule affects both international and domestic produce growers, in that it will establish science-based standards focused on the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce on farms. The key provision areas include agricultural water quality standards and testing, standards for using raw manure and compost, training, control of domestic and wild animals, equipment, tools, buildings, sanitation, as well as worker health and hygiene. The FDA will now put into place an enforceable implementation regulation which explicitly articulates on-farm standards of conduct for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. Sprout operations are covered in a separate rule known as the Sprout Rule. This slide conveys the contribution of different food categories to estimated domestically acquired illnesses and deaths. As you can see, produce contributes a significant amount to the illnesses related to food and part of the deaths related to food consumption. Among all types of foods, produce accounted for nearly half of illnesses, which were most often caused by norovirus. However, the CDC emphasizes that a healthy and safe diet that is high in fruits and vegetables is an important part of a healthy lifestyle. The important common food sources of fatal infections were meat and poultry due to Salmonella and Listeria. This graph highlights the diversity of produce items that have been implicated in foodborne illness outbreaks, where the source of the outbreak likely occurred prior to retail or consumer preparation. Ultimately, contamination can happen to any produce commodity. Therefore, preventing contamination is critical for all fruit and vegetable growers. For this reason, the FSMA Produce Safety Rule does not target specific commodities, but instead focuses on the practices which reduce risks. To begin to understand food safety risk, growers should start with an understanding of what types of microorganisms can contaminate fresh produce. The biggest food safety hazards in fresh produce are pathogens. A human pathogen is a microorganism capable of causing diseases or illness in humans. There are three primary groups of pathogenic microorganisms that are of concern in fresh produce: bacteria, viruses, and parasites. This slide provides a few examples of each type of microorganism, plus a few names of pathogens that you may recognize. However, there are many more pathogens that may cause foodborne illness outbreaks. Chemical and physical food safety hazards are much less common and typically are responsible for fewer serious health outcomes. Chemical food safety risks, such as improper application of pesticides, are certainly a concern, but are much less common than microbial food safety risks. Many chemical hazards are also controlled by established programs outside of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. For example, through EPA pesticide registration and application requirements. Physical food safety risks may present choking hazards or cause someone to chip a tooth, such as from a pebble from the field of the product. Produce safety affects every fruit and vegetable grower. Some growers may be subject to the new FSMA Produce Safety Rule, while other growers are receiving food safety pressure from buyers. Even if there is no regulatory or market pressure, produce safety is critical to every grower because they produce food that consumers will eat. It is important to know that growers are the key to produce safety on the farm, and making the decision to do something on the farm is up to them. All farms, regardless of size, location, or commodities grown, can reduce food safety risks. Growers know their farm best, their production practices, who works on the farm, and all of the other details that go into running a successful business. Those who manage major decisions for the farm and know the day-to-day farm activities need to be involved in assessing food safety risk and developing the farm's food safety plan. Actions to reduce food safety risks not only impact the financial viability of farms, but also the health and safety of those who consume the produce grown. Bacteria are microorganisms that can multiply both inside and outside of a host. Bacteria include pathogens such as E. coli 0157H7, Salmonella, and Listeria monocytogenes. Bacteria can multiply rapidly given the right conditions. These include water, food, and the proper temperature. Good agricultural practices can reduce risk by minimizing situations that support bacterial survival and growth. Produce safety can be challenging for a number of reasons. Many fruits and vegetables are consumed raw, so there is no cooking or kill step to destroy pathogens that may be on the produce. Contamination events are often sporadic, affecting small portions of the crop, so knowing contamination has occurred is difficult. Microorganisms, as their name suggests, are not easily seen, so contamination is difficult to detect visually. Contamination is usually present at very low levels and difficult to detect through product testing. Rough surfaces, for example, cantaloupes, large folded surface areas, like leafy greens, and stem scars, for example, tomatoes, provide great places for pathogens to hide, thereby making pathogens difficult to remove by any amount of washing at the farm level or in the consumer's home. For these reasons, the focus of produce safety is on preventing contamination from occurring in the first place. Contamination is difficult to remove once present. On the farm, contamination can come from a number of sources. Do growers have these things on their farms? Water, workers, soil, tools, or animals? Of course they do, which is why every grower needs to understand food safety risks and how to reduce them on the farm. The importance of a grower's commitment to produce safety cannot be overstated. The safety of produce depends on the grower and every person who works on the farm. This slide highlights why the commitment is important to produce safety. Identifying produce safety risks on your farm is a critical step to identifying and eliminating these safety risks. Supporting the implementation of food safety policies and practices to reduce risk. Providing equipment and facilities necessary to implement practices that reduce risk. Supporting effective food safety training so everyone can actively be involved in reducing risks. Setting a good and consistent example on your farm. Collectively, all these can help reduce the risk on your farm. Growers need to know what risks exist on their farms before they begin. Many farms have limited resources, so identify the biggest risks and work to minimize those risks first. Implement practices to reduce the risk identified. Practices might include training workers or composting manure before it is applied to fields. Monitor implementation to make sure practices are getting done and being completed correctly. Implement corrective actions to fix a problem identified through the monitoring and prevent it from occurring again. Record keeping is a very useful tool in making sure that tasks are being completed and to visualize trends over time. It is also required for some provisions of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule and for many third-party audits. Assessing produce safety risk requires a systematic review of the farm location, practices, conditions, and typical situations to determine where contamination could most easily occur. Many situations and risks may be discussed. However, each farm has its own unique risks. Growers should focus on learning how they can assess these risks so they can evaluate their own farm. So to assess your farm and practices, look at the location of your farm, fields, and adjacent land activities that may represent risks to the crops you grow. Fecal contamination risk from domesticated or wild animals can also be a food safety risk that can contribute to the safety of your farm. The use of water and manure in crop production, worker training programs, and hygiene facilities. Practices used to grow, harvest, pack, or hold produce, and the tools and equipment used in such situations. Typical and atypical situations. Atypical situations may include disasters such as flooding. A farm food safety plan guides practices to ensure food safety. When growers return to their farms, writing a food safety plan will solidify their ideas and allow them to take action on their own farm to reduce risk. A farm food safety plan is not required under the FSMA produce safety rule, but it is generally accepted as a best practice and is needed for many third-party audits. A farm food safety plan gets you thinking about your farm and your practices. It keeps you organized so you can focus your time and resources more effectively and efficiently. It gives you a plan to follow and assure everyone is involved. It documents your progress as you incorporate food safety practices. It usually is required by third-party audits and some buyers who may be interested or are currently purchasing your produce. While it is not required by the rule, it is still a good idea. In most circumstances, GAP certification is required to access wholesale markets. Most markets require GIP and GAP certification. Some markets may be stricter, especially large grocery store chains. Markets that do not currently require certification or are not very strict may require certification or become stricter in the future. Smaller businesses are often consolidated and also require certification. Consolidation of buyers may lead to stricter food safety requirements for all producers. Food safety requirements may vary by region. To view the food code by region, please see the FDA. Some farmers markets in the country require GAP certification from its sellers. Some producers may be exempt from food safety certification and may think that implementing food safety practices is not important or relevant to their farm practices. However, food safety reduces the risk of foodborne illness, which may damage consumer trust and sales. Even if the foodborne illness did not come from your farm, consumers will still be wary of the product. Food safety certification opens market channels for a chance to grow sales. Some of these markets are only accessible by specific certifications. As time goes on, food safety regulations will only grow stricter, sometimes due to the consolidation of these markets. Food safety practices can significantly improve and enhance your farm's responsibility to safe production of fruits and vegetables. Keeping up with food safety standards makes it easier to implement future food safety regulations. We cannot emphasize enough the importance of good record keeping. Keeping records of your food safety practices helps ensure that a foodborne illness will not be traced back to your farm. Moreover, safer practices build consumer trust and relationships with buyers. If you are GAP certified, your farm is featured on the USDA's website. You can also look at other certified farms, but this is another excellent way to ensure as well as advertise your practices and your farm. Below are some food safety tips that are also incorporated into the produce safety rule training. This alone does not ensure the safety of your farm. However, the steps that you take to reduce or mitigate the risk on your farm will significantly improve the safety of your produce. Frequently wash farming tools and prevent the cross-contamination of lots to other areas of produce. Check for signs of animals on your farm. It is well known that wild and domesticated animals can cause contamination of produce. Wash your hands if a hand washing station is available. If you do not currently have a hand washing station available, we highly encourage the development and implementation of a hand washing station to reduce cross contamination of workers' um, hands and contamination to produce. Attend food safety trainings. There are several different opportunities for trainings to help implement and bring awareness to specific food safety risks as well as ways to mitigate these risks on farms. Minimize handling. The more you touch produce or interact with the produce, the likelihood of cross contamination increases. As we previously mentioned, we highly recommend keeping records. Record keeping is your best friend. The more records you can keep, the better off you will be. Again, if there is not a written record to prove it, then it did not exist or did not happen. As we close, some things to remember include that the FSMA Produce Safety Rule is required by the FDA and GAP is offered by the USDA. In recent news, Harmonized GAP Plus is now equivalent to meet the requirements of the Produce Safety Rule. GAP certification is required to access most markets. Check market requirements before expanding your operations, as different markets may require different certifications, licensing, or training. Keeping up with certification makes it tremendously easier for your farm in the long run. Good food safety practices matter whether or not you are certified because it takes a village, and if everyone is implementing and trying to adhere to good food safety practices and requirements, the safer our produce chain will be. For more information about produce safety, please contact the Mississippi Department of Agriculture and Commerce. We want to draw your attention that Mississippi Department of Agriculture and Commerce does offer a GAP-GIP cost share program. For more information, contact Michael Lassiter. For training, contact Kevin Riggin. For other training and questions and opportunities, please contact Mississippi State University with either Dr. Juan Silva or Dr. Courtney Christ. We would like to thank you again for watching our Food as a Business seminar series. This is supported by the Mississippi State University Extension Service, the Southern Extension Risk Management Education Center, and the United States Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, under the award number 20154920024228.